The orchestra had paused between sets when the woman in grey crossed the length of the ballroom at Wexford House and stopped in front of the Duke of Kildare, and in the half-second before she spoke, every candle in the room seemed to lean toward the moment. She wore no diamonds. Her gown was the color of a winter sky an hour before snow, plain at the hem, mended once at the shoulder with a stitch so fine it could be seen only by someone looking for a reason to dismiss her. She did not curtsy the way the other women curtsied, with the small theatrical dip that asked to be admired. She inclined her head, met his eyes, and asked him to dance. The room did not gasp. The room went still, which was worse, the particular stillness of 200 people deciding all at once not to breathe so that they might hear better. The Duke of Kildare looked at her as a man looks at a door he had thought locked. He did not know her name. He did not know that she had buried her father 11 weeks before, that the house she had grown up in now belonged to a cousin who had measured the windows for new curtains while the coffin still stood in the hall. He did not know that she had walked to this ball because she could no longer afford to keep a carriage, and that the hem of her gown was damp from the last grey mile. He knew only that a woman he had never seen had asked him for the one thing no one in that room ever asked of him, without first calculating what it might be worth. Stay with me through this one, because the woman in grey was about to be made to regret her courage, and the man who would not let that stand did not yet know he had already decided. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and 3 months earlier she had been the daughter of a gentleman. With $400 a year, and a library her father had built shelf by shelf across 30 seasons. Henry Whitmore had not been rich, but he had been respected. The kind of man whose opinion on a disputed line of Virgil settled the argument, and Eleanor had grown beside him, at the long table, by the window reading what he read, arguing where she disagreed, learning to think in a house that had never once told her thinking was unbecoming in a woman. He had died in the second week of October, quietly, with his hand in hers and a half-finished letter on the desk that he never came back to finish. The letter had been to his man of business, and what it would have said, had he lived to seal it, Eleanor would spend the winter trying to discover. Within a fortnight, the cousin had arrived. His name was Mr. Gower, Bartholomew Crewe, and he was the nearest male heir, and the estate was entailed upon him in a chain of inheritance. Henry Whitmore had always meant to break, and had, somehow, in the press of ordinary days, never broken. Crewe was not cruel in the way that leaves marks. He was cruel in the way of a man who genuinely believes that the order of things has arranged itself entirely for his convenience. To the society that had once dined at her father's table, Eleanor became, almost overnight, a difficulty. She was unmarried at 26, which the season counted as a kind of failure already accomplished. She had no fortune now, no house, no settlement, nothing but a trunk of her own clothes, and a small box of her mother's letters, and her father's reading spectacles, which she had taken from his desk before Crewe could decide they, too, were part of the estate. A widow, at least, had been chosen once. A spinster of 26 with no money was a problem. The drawing rooms of the county did not know where to file. At the first card party she attended after the funeral, she heard a woman she had known since girlhood murmur behind a painted fan that it was a pity, of course, but one could hardly be expected to receive a Whitmore now that there was nothing left of the Whitmores but the name. The phrase followed her out into the cold. The poor relation. She heard it again before she had even taken off her gloves, spoken low to a footman by a woman who did not trouble to lower her voice quite enough, and Eleanor understood that this was to be the shape of her new life, that she had been recategorized by people who had eaten her father's bread, and that no protest she could make would do anything but confirm the verdict. The Duke of Kildare was a different kind of problem, the kind the same drawing rooms discussed with appetite, rather than pity. He was 34, unmarried, in possession of an estate that ran for miles along the river, and a title old enough to make newer peers feel provincial. He had returned to the county the previous spring after years no one could fully account for. And he had brought with him a coldness that the mothers of the season found maddening precisely because it could not be flirted away. He danced, rarely, and chose his partners with a deliberation that felt almost like arithmetic. He spoke little. When he did speak, It was in short, level sentences that ended before anyone expected them to, leaving the other person holding the rest of a conversation that would not be continued. The room had decided he was proud. The room is very often wrong about why a man is quiet, and the room had not asked what had happened in the years it could not account for, because the room preferred its own explanation, which required nothing of it but the pleasure of disapproval. What no one in the county knew, because he had told no one and intended to tell no one, was that the Duke of Caldern had once been married, briefly, years before and far from here, to a woman named Frances, whom he had loved with the whole undivided force of a young man who has not yet learned that love does not exempt anyone from chance. Frances had died in her first winter as his wife, of a fever that took her in 9 days, and the physician had come too late because Caldern, away in town on business he could not afterward remember the importance of, had not been sent for until the case was already lost. He had carried since then the particular grief of a man who believes a different decision, a single different morning, would have changed everything. He did not speak of her. He kept her miniature in the inner pocket of his coat, over his heart, where his hand went sometimes without his permission, and he had built around the wound a discipline so complete that the county mistook the scar tissue for the man. He had decided, in the years it could not account for, that he would not marry again, that he had used up his portion of that kind of luck, and that the safest course for everyone was to want nothing he could lose. So when the woman in gray crossed the ballroom and asked him to dance, she asked a question that ran underneath the question, though she could not have known it, and the part of him that had been holding its breath for years heard the second question and did not know how to refuse it. He had been standing near the terrace doors, half in shadow, watching the dancers with the detachment of a man who has come to a ball only because his absence would be discussed more than his presence. He had noticed her earlier, though he would not have called it noticing. He had seen a woman in gray stand at the edge of the room for an hour without being approached, seen the small, careful way she held herself, the way she did not drift toward the wall, the way the overlooked usually drift, but stood her ground at the center of her own small patch of floor, as though daring the room to remove her from it. He had seen her decline a glass of wine from a passing tray, with a movement so economical it was almost invisible, and he had understood, in a way he could not have explained, that she declined it because she could not be certain of being offered another and would not be caught wanting. He had looked away. He had looked back. And then she was crossing the floor toward him, and the orchestra had stopped and the room was holding its breath, and Eleanor Whitmore stood in front of the Duke of Caldern and said in a voice that did not shake, although her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, that she hoped he would forgive the irregularity. But she wished to dance, and she had observed that he did not, and she had decided that she would rather be refused by him than ignored by everyone. For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched until it became its own event, until the woman with the painted fan leaned toward her neighbor, until Crewe, who had brought Eleanor to the ball precisely so that the county might watch her fail to belong to it, allowed himself a small, satisfied tightening at the corner of his mouth. And then the Duke of Caldern inclined his head the smallest fraction, and held out his hand and said that he did not dance, but that he would make an exception, and the room let out its breath all at once, in a sound like wind moving through a field. She had not expected him to say yes. That was the thing that undid her composure briefly. In the half-second, before she took his hand, she had crossed the floor with the reckless clarity of someone who has nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to fear, and she had been entirely prepared for the cut, had in some part of herself wanted it, the clean public confirmation that the world had finished with her, because a thing that is finished can at least be grieved and set down. His yes was harder to hold than a no would have been. His hand closed around hers, and even through 2 layers of glove she felt the warmth of it, and her own treacherous body, which had been cold for 11 weeks, leaned toward that warmth before her mind had given any permission at all. They danced. He was not a graceful man in the way that dancing masters reward, but he was certain, and he moved her through the figures with a steadiness that asked nothing of her but that she let herself be guided. He did not make conversation. She had braced for conversation, for the small testing questions by which the county established who one was and whether one mattered, and he asked her none of them. He asked instead, when the figure brought them close, whether she had eaten anything that evening, and the question was so absurd, so far outside the script of a ballroom, that she nearly laughed and answered before she could weigh it that she had not, and watched something move behind his eyes that she could not read. When the dance ended, he returned her to the edge of the room, bowed and left her there, and she stood with her heart going hard and fast in her throat, and understood that she had no idea at all what had just happened to her. What had happened, though neither of them would have said so, was that the Duke of Kildare had spent the length of one dance discovering that he wanted to know the name of the woman in grey, and the wanting alarmed him more than anything had alarmed him in years. He found out her name within the hour. He found out a great deal more by the end of the week, because a man with his resources does not have to wonder for long, and what he found out arranged itself into a picture that would not let him sleep. The dispossessed daughter. The entailed house. The cousin who had taken everything the law would let him take and a few things it would not, and who had brought her into society not to launch her, but to dispose of her, to demonstrate her irrelevance so thoroughly that no one would think to question his possession of what had been hers. Kildare understood the strategy because he understood men like Crewe, and he understood turning the miniature over in his pocket without looking at it, that he had walked into the edge of something he had spent years swearing he would never walk into again. Eleanor, for her part, told herself the dance had meant nothing. She told herself this with great firmness over the following days, in the narrow rented room above a milliner's shop where she now lived on the last of the money her father's watch had brought, and she did not believe herself for a moment. She had felt the warmth of his hand. She had heard the question about whether she had eaten, and she had understood, lying awake, that it had not been a polite question, that it had been a real one, that somewhere behind the famous coldness was a man who had looked at her for the length of an hour at the edge of a ballroom, and had counted correctly the cost of her pride. No one had looked at her that closely. In a long time her father had. The thought of her father arrived with the particular pain it always arrived with now, and she took out his reading spectacles, which she kept wrapped in a handkerchief in the small box, and held them, and did not weep, because she had decided early that weeping was a luxury she could not yet afford, having too much still to do. The thing she had to do was discover what her father's last letter would have said. She had found it, unfinished and unsent, when she went back to the house one final time to collect the few belongings Crewe had grudgingly allowed her, and she had read the 3 lines he had managed before his hands stopped. They concerned a settlement. They concerned, specifically, a sum of £3,000 that Henry Whitmore believed to have been set aside for his daughter years before, in a trust that the entail could not touch, and which he had written to his man of business to confirm and release. The letter broke off in the middle of an instruction. Eleanor did not know whether the trust existed, whether the money was real, whether her father in his last illness had confused a hope with a fact. She knew only that if it existed, it was hers, and that it would mean she need not marry where she did not choose, need not become a governess in a stranger's house, need not depend on the charity of people who counted receiving her a condescension. She had taken the letter to her father's man of business, a careful elderly solicitor named Mr. Pellow, and Mr. Sell and Mr. Twellow. Pellow had looked grave, and said the matter was not simple, that the documents establishing such a trust would have been kept among the family papers, and that the family papers were now, regrettably, in the possession of Mr. Crewe. Crewe, when she wrote to him asking leave to examine her father's papers, replied with a courtesy so smooth it was nearly a slap. He would be delighted, he wrote, to assist his cousin in any reasonable matter, but he could not in good conscience permit the family records to be disturbed by someone who, however dear, no longer had any standing in the family's affairs. He suggested between the lines and then almost upon them, that her difficulties might be very simply resolved if she would consider the offer of marriage made by his friend Sir Joseph Marlowe, a widower of 60 with a gout and a temper and an estate adjoining Crewe's own, a match that would settle Eleanor tidily out of everyone's way and would, not incidentally, unite 2 neighboring properties under arrangements convenient to Crewe. The poor relation, Crewe wrote, in a phrase he clearly enjoyed, could not afford to be particular. There it was a second time, in a different setting, in ink this time, rather than air, the same dismissal wearing the same 3 words, and Eleanor read it, standing at the window of her narrow room, and felt the cold of the glass against her forehead, and understood that she was being closed in. She did not know that the Duke of Caldern had called twice at Mr. Pellow's office that same week. She did not know that he had asked the solicitor, in his short, level way, what could be done for a woman in her position, and that Mr. Pellow, bound by discretion, had told him almost nothing, but had told it in a manner that confirmed everything. She did not know that Caldern had made inquiries of his own about the trust, that he had a man in town turning over records in the offices where such things were registered, that he had decided, against every resolution of the careful years, to involve himself. She knew only that she met him again, by an arrangement that felt too convenient to be entirely accidental, at the lending library in the town, where she had gone to return a book she could no longer be a subscriber to keep, and where he was standing among the shelves as though men of his rank routinely spent their mornings in provincial reading rooms. This is the second time I will ask you to stay close, because what happened in that library was the hinge of everything, and it happened so quietly that the assistant at the desk did not even look up. If the story is reaching you, leave a word below to say, "So now." The library. He had a book in his hand when she came in, and he did not put it down, and he did not bow with the elaborate courtesy that the ballroom required. He simply turned and saw her, and said her name, Miss Whitmore. It was the first time he had said it aloud to her, and the saying of it changed something in the air between them, because a name said plainly by a person who has taken the trouble to learn it is a small act of restoration to someone the world has spent weeks unnaming. She stopped among the shelves. He asked her what she was reading, and she told him, and the conversation that followed was the first real conversation she had had since her father died, the kind of conversation in which two people forget to perform and simply think aloud at one another, disagreeing, refining, returning. He knew the book. He had opinions about it that were wrong in her view, and she said so, and he did not take offense. And she watched the famous coldness become something else entirely, become a tension, become the particular warmth of a man who has not been argued with by an equal in a very long time, and had not known how much he missed it. They talked until the light through the high windows had moved across the floor. And then, because she had learned that good things were now to be distrusted, she asked him directly why he was there, what he wanted, whether his interest in her difficulties was a kindness or a calculation, because she had had her fill of men who calculated. He was quiet for a long moment. His hand moved, not quite to his coat pocket but toward it, and stopped. He told her that he had once failed to be present for someone who needed him, and that he had spent a number of years arranging his life so that he would never again be in a position where his presence or absence could matter to another person, and that he had begun to suspect this arrangement had been a coward's piece rather than a wise one. He did not say Francis's name. He did not explain the failure. He said only that he had watched her decline a glass of wine at a ball because she would not be caught wanting, and that he had recognized the gesture, and that he had found he could not unsee it. It was not a declaration. It was nothing a chaperone could have objected to, had a chaperone been present, which was itself a small impropriety. Neither of them remarked. Yet it was the most that man had said about himself to anyone in years, and Eleanor understood the weight of it, and she did not press him for the name he had not said. What followed was a slow, careful season of proximity that the county watched with rising disapproval and rising appetite in equal measure. He did not court her in any way the drawing rooms could name and condemn. He sent no flowers. He made no offer. And yet he was present, with a steadiness she came to rely on before she admitted she relied on it, at the small public occasions she could still afford to attend, and he had a way of arriving at the moment a room had decided to be unkind to her, and changing the room's mind simply by standing near her and refusing to find her negligible. Once at a subscription concert, when Crewe loudly wondered to a companion whether his cousin's gown had been turned, Caldern crossed to Eleanor and asked her opinion of the second movement, in a voice that carried, and the room which took its cues from him whether it liked him or not, adjusted itself. And Crewe's malice fell into the silence and lay there unanswered. She knew what he was doing. She told herself she resented being protected. Her body, which by now knew the sound of his step and turned toward it before her mind could stop it, told a different truth, and she had stopped being able to fully ignore the difference. The trust was real. Coldern's men in town confirmed it. In the second week of December, found the registration, found the date, found the sum of £3,000, settled on Eleanor Whitmore by her maternal grandmother in a deed that the entail upon the Whitmore estate could not reach. A deed that required only the original instrument among the family papers to be produced and proved. The money was hers. It had always been hers. And the single document that would prove it sat in a locked cabinet in the study of the house that had been her father's, in the keeping of a man who had every reason to ensure it was never found, because so long as it was never found, Eleanor remained a poor relation who could not afford to be particular. And the marriage, with all its convenient adjoining acres, remained the simplest solution to the difficulty of her existence. Caldern brought her this news himself, in Mr. Sybil Pellow's office, with the solicitor present as propriety required, and Eleanor sat very still and felt the room go bright and strange around her. She was not poor. She had never been poor, only robbed. And the man who had robbed her was the same man who held the proof of the robbery, and who would, the moment he understood that the proof was being sought, find a fire for it. Mr. Pellow said as much, gently. A demand for the papers would only warn Crewe to destroy them. A legal action without the instrument in hand would fail. The document had to be obtained before Crewe knew it was wanted, and there was no lawful way to compel a man to open his own cabinet. Eleanor looked at the two men and understood that the law, which she had been raised to believe was a kind of slow justice, had arranged itself, here as everywhere, for the convenience of the man already in possession. It was Eleanor who found the way, and the finding of it was the costly act that the rest would turn upon. She remembered that her father's papers had not all been kept in the study cabinet. She remembered that the most important among them, the ones he called the heart of the house, he had kept in a particular place known only to the family, a hollow behind a panel in the library that her grandfather had built and her father had shown her as a child, with the solemnity of a man entrusting a secret. If the original deed existed anywhere, it might be there where Crewe, who had never been shown the house's heart, because he had never been part of its life, would not have thought to look. Yet to reach it, she would have to enter the house, and she would have to do it without Crewe's knowledge, and she would have to do it soon, because Crewe had announced his intention to take up permanent residence after Christmas, and to put the library to rights, which meant strangers among the shelves, which meant the panel found by accident, and the secret spent. She did not ask Caldern to help her. This is the thing the county never understood, when the county later tried to make the story into one about a duke who rescued a ruined girl. She did not ask him. She told him what she meant to do because she had reached the point of telling him things, and he listened. And then he did the one thing she had not expected, which was that he did not try to stop her, and he did not try to do it for her. He asked what she needed. She said she needed only a way into the house on an evening when Crewe was from home, and an hour, and someone to know where she was, in case the hour went wrong. He arranged for Crewe to be invited to a card party at a neighboring estate, an invitation Crewe could not refuse, because it came from people whose good opinion he was still climbing toward. And on the appointed evening, in a borrowed cloak, with the housekeeper who had loved her father and had stayed on under Crewe. Out of a loyalty she did not extend to him, admitting her at the garden door, Eleanor Whitmore walked back into the library where she had learned to read. The room was cold, and the shelves were the same. And the long table by the window stood where it had always stood, and for a moment the grief of it nearly stopped her. Then she crossed to the panel her father had shown her, and she pressed it where he had pressed it, and it gave. And inside the hollow, wrapped in oilcloth exactly as her grandfather had left it, was a packet of papers, and among them, when her cold fingers found it, the deed. Her grandmother's hand, her own name. £3,000. She knelt on the floor of her father's library with the proof of her own freedom in her hands, and she did, finally, weep, briefly, because there was no one to see it and because some things must be paid for in the only currency the body keeps. She did not weep for long. there were footsteps in the hall. The card party, it transpired, had ended early, or Crewe had grown suspicious, or chance had simply done what chance does. And the door of the library opened, and Bartholomew Crewe stood in it with a candle in his hand and an expression that moved from astonishment to comprehension. He saw the open panel. He saw the papers in her hands. He understood, all at once, exactly what she had found, and exactly what it meant, and the smooth courtesy he had worn for 3 months fell away entirely. And what stood revealed beneath it was simply a frightened, greedy man who had been on the point of getting away with a great deal. He told her she was trespassing. He told her she was a thief, that the papers were the property of the estate, that he would have her taken up before a magistrate, that no one would take the word of a penniless spinster who had broken into a house at night against the word of its master. He crossed the room toward her, with his hand out for the deed, and Eleanor stood and held the papers behind her and did not run because she had stopped being able to be made to run. And she said, in the level voice she had learned from her father, that the deed was hers, that it had her name upon it, that he might take her before any magistrate he liked, and she would be glad of the chance to read it aloud in open court. It was the housekeeper who had sent word. The good, loyal woman at the garden door, who had not liked the look of the carriage returning early, had done the one thing she could think to do, which was to send the stable boy running to the only person Miss Whitmore had told her to send to, if the hour went wrong. So that when Crewe's hand was an arm's length from the deed, and his voice had risen to the edge of something that would not have stopped at words, the library door opened a second time, and the Duke of Caldern came into the room. And the temperature of the scene changed entirely. He did not raise his voice. He did not cross the room in 3 strides and lay hands on Crewe, though Eleanor saw in the first instant that some part of him wished to, and saw him decide against it, saw the discipline of the careful years hold. He simply stood inside the door, filling it, and asked Crewe, in a tone of perfect level courtesy, whether he was quite certain he wished to summon a magistrate, given that the magistrate would necessarily inquire into the document the lady was holding, and into the question of why the lawful property of Miss Eleanor Whitmore had been found concealed in a house her cousin had taken some pains to keep her out of. The question hung in the air. Crewe looked from the Duke to Eleanor and back, and the arithmetic ran visibly behind his eyes, and arrived where Caldern had already known it would arrive, at the understanding that a magistrate was the last thing in the world Bartholomew Crewe could now afford to summon. His hand came down. His face worked. He said something about misunderstanding, about a regrettable confusion, about how, of course, if the document was genuinely his cousin's, then naturally the matter could be settled between gentlemen without recourse to anything unpleasant. He was no longer the master of the house. He was a man bargaining for the size of his own disgrace, and he knew it. What Caldern did then was the thing Eleanor would turn over in her mind for the rest of her life. He did not crush Crewe. He had the power to, in that moment, had the standing and the witnesses he could summon, and the social weight to make Crewe a byword in 3 counties. And he chose instead to give the man a road out narrow enough to be a punishment, and wide enough to be taken. He told Crewe that the deed would be proved, that the £3,000 would be paid to Miss Whitmore in full, that Mr. Dontress Pellow would call upon him in the morning to arrange the particulars, and that if these things were done without difficulty, the circumstances of this evening need never be discussed in any drawing-room in the county. If they were not done, he added, the same level tone unchanged, then the circumstances would be discussed everywhere, beginning with the card party Crewe had so recently left. It was mercy and it was discipline in the same breath. And Crewe, who had counted on a world that arranged itself for his convenience, found himself for once inside an arrangement made by someone else, and took the road he was given because the alternative had been closed. He left the room. They heard the front door and the carriage. And then the house was quiet, in the particular way of a house from which a wrong has just departed. Eleanor stood with the deed in her hands in the library where she had learned to read, and the Duke of Caldern stood by the door, and neither of them spoke for a moment, because the moment was too large for the small coin of speech. Then he crossed the room, slowly this time, and he stopped in front of her at exactly the distance she had crossed to him in the ballroom 3 weeks and a lifetime before, and he looked at her, and Eleanor understood that the question she had asked him on the dance floor was about to be asked back to her in a different form, and that her whole heart had already answered it. He did not make a speech. The man who could not say his dead wife's name was never going to make a speech. He took the miniature from his coat, the small, worn portrait. His hand had gone to 1,000 times. And he looked at it once, and then he did something he had not done in all the careful years, which was to put it away gently, as one puts away a thing one has finally finished mourning, rather than gripping it as one grips a thing one is afraid of losing. And then he said her name, Eleanor, the given name. This time, the marked, deliberate use of it, and he said that he had spent years wanting nothing he could lose, and that he had discovered, watching her cross a ballroom toward the certainty of refusal, that he had already lost the argument, and that he would be honored beyond anything. He had a right to ask if she would consent to be the thing he could not bear to lose. 6 words at the center of it, when they came, plain as the deed in her hand. Marry me. Let the room watch. She did not answer at once because the moment deserved the weight of being held, and because some part of her, the part that had been told for 3 months that she was a difficulty to be solved, needed to feel the truth of being chosen, settle all the way down before she could speak it back. Then she put her hand in his, the way she had on the dance floor, and she said yes, and the cold she had carried for 11 weeks went out of her at last. They were married in the 2nd week of January, quietly, in the small church near Calderne's estate, with Mr. Pello as a witness and the loyal housekeeper weeping frankly in the second pew, and a hard bright winter sun coming through the plain glass. Eleanor wore gray. She had considered other colors, and had decided, with the dry private humor her father had given her, and that she was beginning to be able to use again, that gray had served her well enough, and she would not abandon it now that it had won. The £3,000 was paid in full, and she settled the greater part of it, to the astonishment of Mr. Pello. Not upon herself, but into a trust of her own devising, a fund to assist gentlewomen left as she had been left, dispossessed and recategorized, and told they could not afford to be particular because she had learned exactly what such women could and could not afford. And she had decided to be the kind of person her father had raised her to be, rather than the kind of person the season had tried to make her. Crewe paid his debts and removed to the north and was not, in the end, much discussed, which was a worse fate for a man of his ambitions than scandal would have been. Sir Joseph Marlowe married someone else's convenient cousin, and was by all accounts exactly as disagreeable to her as he would have been to Eleanor, and Eleanor, hearing of it, felt only a brief, clean gratitude for the door she had not been forced to walk through. The county adjusted itself as counties do, and decided that it had always known the Duke of Calderne and the new Duchess were perfectly suited, and the woman with the painted fan told everyone she had seen it from the very first, from the moment the girl crossed the ballroom, which was almost true, since she had seen it and called it a disgrace. On the first evening that the house was truly theirs, when the servants had gone and the fire had burned down to the steady red of a fire, that means to last the night, Eleanor sat in the library at Calderne, which her husband had given over to her entirely on the grounds that he had observed she could not be kept out of libraries, and he had no wish to try. Snow had begun to fall outside the high windows, the first real snow of the winter, and it came down slow and certain in the light of the candles, and the long room held the particular warmth of a place where a person is finally, simply, at home. She had her father's reading spectacles in her hand. She had taken them out of the small box that no longer needed to be kept ready for sudden flight, and she had set them on the table beside the book she was reading, where they caught the firelight, and she thought of the long table by the window, in the house she had lost, and understood that she had not lost it after all. That she had carried the heart of it out in a handkerchief and a borrowed cloak, and had set it down at last in a room where it could stay. Her husband came in and sat across from her without speaking, the way they had learned to sit together, 2 people who did not need to fill a silence to be sure of one another, and he looked at the spectacles on the table, and did not ask, because he had learned the shape of her griefs, as she had learned the shape of his. Outside, the snow went on falling. The fire held. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had crossed a ballroom toward what she was sure would be a refusal, and had been answered instead by the whole of the rest of her life, set down her father's spectacles and turned the page, and was at home. If Eleanor's journey moved you, stay a moment and leave a word with the part that reached you most. And thank you for staying until the very end.